And our last but not least speaker is Viviane Morrigan. So if you're ready, Viviane, I'd like to turn it over to you.
I live on unceded Wangal Eora land, otherwise known as Leichhardt. So WDI's Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights aims to reaffirm women's sex-based rights as set out in the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, that is CEDAW, which was adopted by the United Nations General Assembly on the 18th of December 1979, a little more than 42 years ago, and a more developed version adopted in the UN Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women in 1993, 29 years ago. You can see I like history. In 2018, barely 4 years ago, the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights was written by UK-based Maureen O'Hara, Sheila Jeffries, and Heather Brunksall Evans, who founded the Women's Human Rights Campaign, WHRC, now the WDI, with Joe Brew. It's really important to me to acknowledge all these women who've done such wonderful work for women. Their aim was to counter the alarming rise of gender ideology that was undermining these basic and hard-fought-for women's rights. In a short time, this small band of women has been pivotal in re-establishing a vibrant international feminist network and community of radical feminists keen to speak up and act to further women's liberation. They certainly have inspired me. MDI's online declaration and regular webinars, such as this one, are an exciting feminist and technological intervention that Andrea Noboa, and I'm not sure if I've pronounced that correctly, a Brazilian journalist and writer and women and children's rights advocate, has likened to, quote, a modern implementation of the consciousness-raising programs of the 1960s. And I agree with her entirely. Today, we focus on the Declaration's Articles 4 and 5 that reaffirm women's rights to freedoms of opinion and expression and peaceful assembly and association. I'd like to recount tonight examples of how these rights have been undermined for lesbians and other women in Australia as a result of gender ideology, the new patriarchal weapon of the men's rights movement. So firstly, freedom of opinion and expression. An example is no platforming, happening all around the world, but in Australia, some examples that I've come across are Carolyn Norma, who was removed from the list of speakers at an academic conference in Sydney because of her gender critical views. In Melbourne, Reading's Bookshop apologised for holding a book launch for Julie Bindel when a person complained about her gender critical views 3 years later after the event. And even this, I came upon this today, the lesbian YouTuber Ariel Scarcella, whose politics I share little in common with, was banned when she tried to visit from the US to join a Sydney Mardi Gras discussion panel in 2020. This was when she identified with the LGBT community, but did not accept that men who identify as trans women are women. Another example is of problems with us being robbed of our freedom of opinion and expression is the cancelling of social media accounts. Holly Lawford Smith, for example, but there are many, many others that I know of in the Facebook groups that I belong to that are gender critical. Another example is the cancelling of funding for women's organisations. I gave some money to a crowdfunding thing once, and we were told that the crowdfunding would not be allowed to continue and we would get our money back. Well, I've never got my money back, and I don't think anyone else I know has either. There's also the exclusion of women's groups from consulted reference groups. It's usually LGBTQ groups who are involved in the preparation of new legislation on SOGI conversion practices and self-ID for transgender identified people, and lots of other consultations that happen at the policy level. Nobody's really interested in lesbian-only groups on consulting with us. Another example is bullying and other forms of harassment, such as campus debates in Sydney and Melbourne, The one in Sydney that I went to for a couple of years ago, we were invaded by a whole lot of young people chanting in our faces and treating us like we were the enemy. It was humorous, but it was also disturbing. There's also the loss of accommodation by the Feminist Legal Clinic in Sydney, and the workplace bullying and intimidation of many gender-critical women, such as Holly Lawford-Smith, etc. There have been legal attacks using anti-discrimination laws, such as the attack against Beth Rep, a radio personality in the ACT, who was fined, I think, $10,000 for some small comments she made on a Facebook page, I think it was. What we're doing is we're speaking up. Lots of women, and you've heard tonight, lots of women are making submissions to inquiries, speaking up, trying to challenge their transgender movement and ideology. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a little while, about a group I'm in. The second article is about the Peaceful Assembly and Association of Women. Today I was looking at a YouTube presentation Susan Hawthorne was one of the people who spoke, and she reminded us about a book she wrote coming from her thesis called In Defense of Separatism, which concludes with a call for women of all sexualities to have separate spaces so we can work together to change the world and end patriarchy. Isn't that a lovely thought? The other speaker was Nicole, who's looking after the Lesbian Lost Spaces project, which gives an account of the impact of trans inclusion on the loss of lesbian spaces and culture. 102 lesbian spaces in Victoria alone were counted by the women in this project, and they can now only count 3 lesbian-only organisations today, from 102 to 3 in the whole of Victoria. That is shocking. And then, of course, is the whole issue of lesbian space. In Tasmania, Jessica Halloyle, a lesbian and member of the LGB Alliance Tasmania, made an application on behalf of the organisation to get legal permission to make their lesbian events single sex. The Anti-Discrimination Commissioner in Tasmania, Sarah Bolt, banned them from hosting lesbian events that exclude trans women on the grounds that such gatherings carry a significant risk of breaching existing equalities legislation. And that's a sad indictment on the changes that have been effected by the trans movement against legislation that used to protect us. There will be a final hearing on the 10th of March, and if they're unsuccessful, they will take the appeal to the High Court, and I'm looking forward to that battle. It's going to be very expensive. I think we'll all be digging in our pockets to support them. In Sydney, I was involved on the outskirts of the Lesbian Space Project. Can't remember, that was in the 80s, I think it was. Went to a wonderful fundraising concert in the Sydney Town Hall. Lots of women donated money. They set up a space in Newtown. And then I think someone was talking about it earlier. It all fell apart. Lots of anger, sadness, disappointment. A lot of lesbians walked away feeling very unhappy. Nevertheless, out of the ruins has come Link, which gives small amounts of funds to lesbians for various projects. So it's not all bad. And in Adelaide, Sappho's party, a private party advertised with flyers, hence considered a public event. And it wasn't allowed to go ahead. And after that, a lot of lesbian events went underground for quite a while. There's also been lesbian conferences and festivals that I've enjoyed, held in various capital cities. Brisbane was an eye-opener to me when a so-called trans woman arrived with an entourage of his supporters, of women, lesbians mainly. That was very controversial, and a lot of women were very distressed by that. The other lesbian conference and festival I went to was, I think, in 2011, and there was a fabulous concert at the Sydney Opera House. So we made our own women's space. Another area of women's space being invaded is the Mardi Gras and IWD. Trans supporters have committed violent acts. I think Chris could tell you a bit about that. And a lot of lesbians I know don't get involved in Mardi Gras anymore because of that. I used to enjoy going to women's dances and bars. I don't anymore. Could be my age as well. Other spaces are women's toilets. They've been mentioned earlier today. And of course, I don't think I've heard this mentioned, but women's services, rape crisis centres and DV shelters, they have suffered a lot from invasions from trans-identified men and women who support them. And let's not forget hospital wards and prisons and what's going on there. So I just want to move on to the final bit of my talk, which is to say that I'm a member of a number of lesbian, feminist, and gender critical online activist groups, such as 1040 Matrix, a New South Wales-based social lesbian organisation with the Older Dykes website. But my main commitment is to COAL, the Coalition of Activist Lesbians, which Chris mentioned earlier, where I'm a member of the National Committee. COAL is a not-for-profit national advocacy organisation formed in 1994 to work towards ending discrimination against lesbians. And here I'd like to acknowledge Lavender, Sand and Jack in particular for the tremendous groundbreaking work that they had in setting that up and supporting the organisation, which was quite dynamic there for quite a while. The organisation is community-based and operates within a human rights and women-centric framework to protect lesbian human rights and to support lesbians across 6 state and 2 territory jurisdictions to participate in activities for positive social change. When the organisation formed, it was the only lesbian NGO holding accreditation with the United Nations Economic and Social Council, ECOSOC, as well as the Division of the Advancement of Women. COAL is Australia's only lesbian-specific organisation that advocates on many issues to all levels of government. Last year, we funded a range of workshops with the aim of building the capacity of volunteers to contribute to the organisation and improve networking through training in computer-based skills, project organisation, media and community engagement. The project was inclusive of volunteers from other community networks, different age groups, those living in different states and in isolated regions. We're setting up a website, we're producing a newsletter, we provide speakers at conferences and other meetings and write submissions and reports. And some examples of those are submissions to the inquiries in Queensland, Victoria and Tasmania on SOGI conversion practices, the proposed federal religious discrimination bill. We made complaints to UN Women about violations of the human rights of women and girls in Australia, and the preparation and participation in the annual UN NGO Commission on the Status of Women Open Forum. It'll be held, it's held every year. COAL would very much like to increase our input into improving the lives of lesbians and expanding our membership to be more inclusive. I'd encourage any Australian lesbians watching and listening tonight to apply to become a member. Simply email us at coalitionofactivistlesbians, all lowercase, @gmail.com to ask for an application form. Membership rates are very reasonable, $5, $15 and $25, and you'll need to provide the name of a proposer who is known to COAL already. We have heard of efforts by LGBTQ activists to infiltrate our group, and we're careful to protect our organisation and membership from the unethical and bullying tactics of those pushing gender ideology. Thank you.